No, I don't think it is. I think from that point of view, I suppose that if Ken Livingston were to win, in a way we'd have a quieter life over the next week than if Frank Dobson wins, because the extraordinary thing is that Livingston has said now that if he doesn't win and Dobson is declared the winner, he's going to give the Prime Minister 7 days to make up his mind, and Dobson to make up his mind to get him to stand down. So it's going to run and run if Dobson is declared the technical victor. I suppose it will be a bit of a technicality because we already know that, in fact, Frank Dobson has lost overwhelmingly in the trade union section, and he's going to lose in the constituency section. So all he's going to be elected by is by his peers in the House of Commons and a scattering of MEPs, whose votes are worth 1,000 times the number of votes of an individual member of the Labour Party.
Well, what do you think the result will bubble down to?
I think it will bubble down to basically you know, the feeling of the grassroots about the government. What I think a lot of people who are among the 49,000 they're now saying, I don't know if they're saying they have voted or whether they're eligible to vote, the individual members in London. I think a lot of them just wanted to give the government a black eye. They weren't absolute devotees of Ken Livingston. But here was an opportunity to say to the government, don't forget the party. And that's what I think a lot of people have voted on.
So in those terms, it's not unlike a mid-term by-election.
Yeah, I think there is a comparison there. And of course it is a first. We've never had this kind of popular election. Primary, indeed, really, is what we've had in both parties. So we've been breaking new ground. The Liberal Democrats just had a candidate and put her in, but in the case of Archer, who was first elected, they had a primary. So we have seen primaries, which is what this is. It's not the actual election, doesn't come till next May. And also, we are seeing for the first time a popularly elected municipal leader, a local government leader, who is elected not by the local councillors in the council chamber, but is elected by the range of voters across the area which he wants to be mayor of.
All right, Tony Howard for the moment, thank you. Let's go to the weather now with Dan Corbett.
Hello there. It was a chilly morning for a lot of...
This is BBC News 24 with me, Peter Cowie. A summary now of the latest news at exactly 1:30. The result of the race to become Labour's candidate for London Mayor is to be announced any moment now. The contest is poised on a knife edge between Frank Dobson, Tony Blair's favoured candidate, and the left-winger Ken Livingston, but there are signs that Mr Livingston may be preparing to challenge the result if he loses narrowly. Police in Northern Ireland say they've made a number of arrests following the murder of 2 teenagers from Portadown yesterday. The bodies of David McElwain, aged 18, and Andrew Robb, who was 19, were found on a country road near the town of Tandragee. The IUC said the arrests had not been made under anti-terrorism laws, but gave few other details. Buckingham Palace has confirmed that a member of staff has been dismissed after allegedly making remarks about poisoning the Queen's food. The woman had worked at Sandringham for 3 months as a kitchen porter. A spokesman for the palace has said that at no time was there a direct threat to the Queen's well-being. Supporters of the Texas Governor George W. Bush are celebrating following a convincing win in the South Carolina presidential primary elections. The victory is a boost for the Bush camp, which had suffered an upset in New Hampshire, which was won by his Republican rival, John McCain. Senator McCain said he'd fight on in the race for the White House. The body of a man has been recovered at the foot of cliffs, and an 11-year-old boy is being treated for hypothermia after a search was launched last night in West Wales. The police say the alarm was raised after the boy and his grandfather failed to return for a walk in the Penbryn area of Cardigan Bay. The youngster was found clinging to the cliff face above Penbryn Beach. A police constable from Lancashire is still being questioned by officials in India of allegations that he was involved in a plot to smuggle £1 million worth of heroin into Britain. Shabir Rahman Abdul Mubarak was detained along with 4 other men as he boarded a flight in Bombay bound for Manchester. British consular officials are waiting to see him. A demonstration has been taking place in London to call for a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit in all built-up areas. Dozens of people laid down the road in front of the Houses of Parliament, each holding a white cross. The protesters said the crosses represented the number of lives expected to be lost on Britain's roads before the government publishes its review of speed limits in 10 days' time. Most votes have now been counted after the general election in Iran, where it appears the reformists are heading for a parliamentary majority. The previous administration was dominated by conservatives who often held up the reforms of President Khatami. Final results aren't due for several days. If the trend continues, reformists will oust Conservatives from Parliament for the first time since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Soldiers from the NATO-led peacekeeping force KFOR have launched a series of raids to seize weapons in the troubled Kosovan town of Mitrovica. More than 1,500 troops have been brought into the divided city in what's being described as a major operation. Around 40 vehicles crossed a bridge from the southern part of the town, which is mainly occupied by ethnic Albanians. At least 10 people have died in violence in the town over the past 2 weeks. Reports in a Sunday newspaper claim insurers Norwich Union are to announce a merger with their rival CGU Group. It would create Britain's largest firm of general insurers. Norwich Union is the biggest single employer in Norwich, and there are fears that the deal could lead to a significant number of job losses. Britain's leading expert on the E. coli bug is warning parents to keep young children away from farms because of the risk of infection. Professor Hugh Pennington's comments were made to BBC One's Country File programme following the case of a 6-year-old boy who contracted E. coli during a farm visit and is now severely brain damaged. The world's first live broadcast on the internet of a demolition explosion has happened in East London. Hundreds of spectators gathered to see the 19-storey tower block get blown up. The BBC presenter from the programme Ground Force, Tommy Walsh, was asked to push the button. There were no reports of any problems following the blast. Sport, and Manchester United have beaten Leeds United 1-0 at Elland Road in the crucial game at the top of the Premier League. Absent from the Man United lineup was David Beckham, who's been dropped by the manager Sir Alex Ferguson after reports of a training ground row. It's believed the argument happened on Friday after the star failed to turn up to training on Thursday. Now, back to our top story, Labour's selection of a candidate for the London mayoral elections. Our chief political correspondent, Nick Robinson, is at Labour headquarters in Westminster. Well, Nick, tell us first, what has Ken Livingston been saying about the possibility of running as an independent if he doesn't gain the nomination?
Peter, he said nothing publicly about that, but there are a whole series of signs about the fact that he may be considering that. He was at one stage declaring that he wouldn't say anything after this result if he lost, that is, for 7 days, but we're just being told that he will make a statement outside his house as soon as he's heard the result, and that result should come within the next 5 minutes. We'll bring it to you here just as soon as we've got it. But Mr. Livingston done other things too. He suggested that Frank Dobson should stand down, even if he wins, but if he only wins very closely, which is what everyone is now expecting, on the grounds that it won't be a true victory because many unions were denied the chance to participate because they hadn't paid their Labour Party dues, and also because 2 unions with almost 1 in 12 of the votes didn't ballot their members and therefore decided, just a small handful of people decided how to cast a very large number of votes indeed. So Mr. Livingston's taken all the steps that would be necessary to put him in a position to run as an independent, but he's not yet uttered any words as to whether he will or he won't.
Why is the Labour leadership, and Tony Blair in particular, so opposed to Ken Livingston in the face of what appears to be the popular vote in London?
This is simply a question of how Ken Livingston acted when he last led London. He was leader of the Greater London Council under Margaret Thatcher's government in the 1980s. 2 views of this, and it's absolutely crucial to this campaign, Peter. On the one hand, some people in the Labour Party, some people on the left of politics, see Ken Livingston, Red Ken as he was then labelled, as a people's champion, as someone who fought an unpopular government, Margaret Thatcher, who fought for things that people cared about in London, who delivered our low tube fares here in London on the Underground too. On the other hand, some, Tony Blair in particular, see him as a divisive character, not serious as a politician, not interested in doing deals with the business community, someone who helped, along with Arthur Scargill and Tony Benn, destroy the Labour Party and prevent it from winning elections for well over a decade.
Would the London Mayor indeed be a good deal more powerful than Ken Livingston was when he was leading the GLC?
Well, I think the key to Ken Livingston's position then and now, if he were to win the race to become London Mayor, would be its symbolic power, its political power. Now, he'd have more power now because if he were to win, it would be on the mandate of millions of ordinary voters. Then he was just leader of a council and chosen by members of the Labour Party who are on that Greater London Council. The actual powers are very limited indeed. Most of the important services like health and education are still run by the government or paid for by the government but run by individual local councils. The Mayor won't be able to control that. Even the very controversial issue of transport is very heavily controlled by government too. But the key power anybody who becomes Mayor will have is they'll have a bigger personal mandate than any other politician in Britain. Much bigger than Tony Blair himself, of course, because he is only directly voted for by his constituents, whereas the new London Mayor will be voted for by many, many millions of people. That'll be his power to embarrass, his power to grandstand, and frankly a power because he's here in London. Now we're just hearing the result now, and I can tell you that Frank Dobson has won the race to become Labour's candidate. Frank Dobson has won that race. We haven't heard the margin yet, but that is the result. It's no huge surprise, and the margin is what will determine whether this race is over and Frank Dobson is unchallenged, or whether it's still very much ongoing.
Well, in terms of the margin, Nick, Frank Dobson was going to have to win by quite a substantial margin if he was going to silence the critics of this whole process, wasn't he?
That's right. Frank Dobson is going to have to win by a big margin. We know he's won. Let me look at the figures now. 51.5% to Frank Dobson, 48.5% to Ken Livingston. A 3% margin there. He will declare it's a victory. A victory is enough. 50 plus 1 is enough. He will say, that'll do me. Many others will say, look, if certain trade unions were allowed to take part, if other unions have been forced to ballot their members, Ken Livingston would now be the candidate.
So more criticism to come, plainly, from within the party and probably from the media as well.
That's right. He's going to be under huge pressure now, Frank Dobson. Ken Livingston was promising to make a statement. I suspect we'll see that and hear that very soon. He is likely to say to Frank Dobson, look, you have lost every single one of the popular ballots in this party, the trade unions and amongst party members. The only group who have voted for you are your own colleagues in the House of Commons and a few members of the European Parliament. He will say you can't win this particular race for the Labour Party because you're seen as Tony Blair's candidate and not as the People's candidate, and he will put huge pressure on Frank Dobson to stand down. As soon as tomorrow, we'll see the evening paper here, the London Evening Standard in London, running a poll which will test whether Ken Livingston as an independent candidate will actually beat Frank Dobson as a Labour candidate. Each of these steps is going to put pressure on Frank Dobson, but let's be honest, Peter, Labour have been prepared for this. Downing Street have been prepared for this. They will pull out every stop now to make sure that Dobson wins and that Livingston is marginalised.
This was, just for the record, Nick, this was a second ballot, wasn't it?
In terms of the, you mean in terms of the transfers, Peter, you're talking about?
Yeah.
Well, I've only got the overall figures at this stage. 51.5%, 48.5% is all I've got. I haven't got the detail, but maybe you have that.
I'm being told at this end, Nick, that that was a second ballot figure.
Well, that shows that Glenda Jackson's... Let's explain what this means. Those members who got to vote in this contest had 2 votes. They voted for their first choice and then for their second. And if there wasn't a margin of victory on the first preferences, then it came to Glenda Jackson's second preferences and where they went. So Frank Dobson has had to be dependent on that to get his victory. Another sign of just how tight it was.
Yes, just looking at those figures, of course, 48.5% to Ken Livingston, 51.5% to Frank Dobson. That adds up to 100. So clearly Glenda Jackson's votes have been reallocated and it seems to have been split both ways.
Well, we expected most second preferences from Glenda Jackson to go to Ken Livingston. We'll bring you those figures as soon as we've got them. We expected those second preferences to go for Ken Livingston, but by no means all, because of course people choosing to vote to Glenda were making a conscious choice not to vote for Ken, as well as not to vote for Frank Dobson as well. So it shows, though, how important it was, how tight it was, that those things mattered. And this is the great difficulty now facing Frank Dobson and the Labour Party, is that people will say, well, he wouldn't have won if this happened. He wouldn't have won if that had happened. It is not a clear, unequivocal victory. On the other hand, we've seen in elections before, we know what politicians say in this situation, Peter. They say winning is all that counts. Getting beyond 50% is all that counts. The next few days will be utterly critical to see how this goes. Do people in the Labour Party weigh up behind Ken Livingston and say this result is wrong, it should be reconsidered? You won't see MPs, let's be clear about this, saying that Livingston should run as an independent, because to do so would risk them being thrown out of the Labour Party. But Peter, look out for this code. When you hear, as Diane Abbott did on News 24 a little bit earlier today, when you hear Labour MPs say, my supporters would be very keen to vote for Ken come what way, my supporters would very much like the chance to vote for Ken Livingston, they are in effect urging Ken Livingston to run as an independent. If that pressure builds, if the polls in tomorrow's newspapers and other media outlets build pressure on Livingston to run, the next few days will be critical to deciding whether he does so or not.
Okay, well, Nick, thanks very much indeed for that thorough analysis. We're rejoined in the studio by the political commentator and historian, Tony Howard. Tony, politicians may well say, particularly when they've won, it's winning that counts, but will that be sufficient for Frank Dobson to argue that in the coming days?
I think it's a bit better for Frank Dobson, oddly enough, than I'd anticipated. I mean, 3% is not, of course, a landslide or anything like that, but it's not, as it were, when Dennis Healey beat Tony Benn for deputy leadership in 1982, the margin was 0.8%. And, you know, that was accepted by Benn.
But that's all very well when there's agreement and there's a well-established voting procedure. But in this case, of course, I mean, we know there are enormous questions about exactly how this figure was arrived at.
I know. Well, I'm puzzled, too, that if it's 51.5 to 48.5, what happened to Glenda's votes? I mean, if it was so close that, obviously, if Glenda has been eliminated and her votes have been reallocated, Glenda Jackson, then it means that on the first ballot, Dobson did not have over 50%, but he's managed to creep up to 1.5 from Glenda's reallocated votes, so he may have done better among those second preferences than we expected. But any idea that he's going to go away is absolute nonsense, and I believe, you know, I believe that in politics there is a sort of momentum that has its way, and I'd only make a guess, but I will be astonished if at the end of the week we don't have an independent candidate for London's mayor and that his name isn't Ken Livingston. That's my prophecy.
You don't think that there is another option, that this whole process will be subjected to judicial review?
Well, he may go to the courts. That would hold it up for probably longer. I don't think he's got much chance of that because he's already sort of protested and got a flea in his ear one or two unions that were disallowed from voting because they were late with putting their subscriptions in, their affiliation fees in, and he lost that in the High Court earlier, or his supporters lost it earlier. So I don't think there's a great deal of room for headway there, but I think that probably after a week, because, as I say, it's very hard, you know, to go up to the top of the mountain, which Livingston's been at, looking down, my city, suddenly to say, oh, well, we lost it. Oh, never mind, back to being an ordinary Labour MP. He's got no future in the House of Commons, none at all, never has had. Now, it may be that, I think it would be very clumsy.
Better be a big fish in a small pool.
Yeah, I think it may be very clumsy. We may see an effort by the Prime Minister to bribe him. We may see the effort of saying, well, Ken, would you like to come and join the government as a parliamentary secretary? I mean, rather lowly form of life. But I don't think that would work, and I think it would look bad. So my guess is that when Ken looks at the future, he decides it's better to have a go. Mean his expulsion from the party, of course. And it means also, as Nick Robinson was telling us, that anyone who actually puts up his hand and says, I am supporting Ken Livingston, will automatically be expelled. And so that's pretty tough. I mean, Diane Abbott can't possibly go and work for him. She can say, my constituents wish him well, but she can't say, I'm voting for Ken Livingston. The moment she says that, she's out. That's the law of politics. Applies to the Tory party too. I mean, it's why Julian Critchley was expelled from the Tory party, why Ian Gilmore was asked to leave. I think he was no longer a member. So it's a fairly universal rule.
But it's okay to speak in code?
It's okay to speak in code, say my supporters would, I think, hope that he might do this. That's you're in the clear. But if you say, and my view is the same, then you're out of the clear and you're into the slammer as far as being a Labour MP is concerned. But I think it will be very difficult for Ken to settle down and adjust to the fact that life has now gone back to what it was before 12 months ago. And I think that the momentum, as I say, will propel him forward. And my guess, I mean, I hope I don't get in trouble with anyone about this, but my guess is that he could be a very formidable candidate, and the polls may well show that he could beat Dobson standing as an independent. The question then, of course, is does he let Steve Norris in as a Tory candidate who must benefit from the split vote?
In a three-way vote.
In a three-way vote. I say, if I'm just drawing a bird of venture, I think he can probably win outright. but that's maybe crazy of me.
You don't think Steve Norris is a strong...
Well, I think Steve Norris is a strong candidate, but I think that he has got the popular wind behind him, this cheeky chappy Ken Livingston. And my guess is that if he were a candidate and was standing as an independent, like, let's say, used to happen in New York, after all, John Lindsay wasn't standing as a Democrat. Fiorella LaGuardia, the famous one with the airport's named after, they were both standing virtually as independents. And in these circumstances, independent candidates do seem occasionally on the other side of the Atlantic anyway to win. And that's something, perhaps, that Tony Blair would have done well to consider before pressing the button for the start of this whole process.
All right, Tony Howard, thanks very much indeed for that. Well, let's just recap on that result. Frank Dobson wins with 51.53% of the votes, and Ken Livingston wins 48.47%. And that was after the votes for Glenda Jackson were redistributed after she was eliminated on the first count. Now back, we can rejoin now our Chief Political Correspondent, Nick Robinson, who's at Labour headquarters in Westminster. He's got some more information for us. Nick.
Peter, that's absolutely right. Those were the headline figures. We can now give you a little bit more detail about what that was actually consisting of. I'll try and simplify it because it's a complicated old system, this. But Tony Howard was absolutely right to say to us there that what those figures meant was that Frank Dobson did not win outright on first preferences. He won 49.569%. Decimal points don't matter a great deal, do they? But the key thing is he didn't make 50% on first preference votes. Ken Livingston got 46.009%. Glenda Jackson's figure, 4.421. So people expressed a first preference, then a second preference, and it was those second preferences which were crucial to get Frank Dobson over the 50% mark. So the next question people will be asking is, well, how did the ordinary members vote? Roughly a third of this electoral college. We don't have numbers of people, but we do have percentages. Ken Livingston did win, but not as overwhelmingly as some people have predicted. 54.9% is what I calculate to be Ken Livingston's vote amongst the ordinary members of the Labour Party. Frank Dobson way down though, 35.1%, and Glenda Jackson on 9.6%. That's when people had their first preferences. So there we see a pretty clear victory for Ken Livingston amongst the members, but not the two-thirds that some people were talking of, and that Frank Dobson really did only just squeeze home.
So that's a pretty thumping majority in terms of the membership for Ken Livingston, a safe one. To what extent do you think that can be extrapolated into voters in London?
Very, very difficult judgment to make. What Labour say when you ask them about this is, look, people were voting for Ken Livingston if they were, on the basis that he was a Labour supporter, a Labour campaigner, the fact that he said several times, I was born in the Labour Party, I will die in the Labour Party. He said he didn't want to leave the Labour Party. And so they suggest, were he ever to run as an independent, that some of that support would disappear. The truth is we simply don't know, because it does seem that quite a lot of the support for Ken Livingston has been because people want to kick the government. They are quite content to vote for someone they see as a Labour supporter, but someone who's not a Tony Blair supporter. And therefore, the next few days will be critical. Opinion polls, opinion in the Labour Party, to see how much support would Ken Livingston keep if he would decide to shed an entire lifetime working for this party and actually to leave it behind. It could be very dangerous for him. Some people have been very damaged when they split from their party. Look at the pro-European Conservatives in the European elections, or Derek Hatton, the left-winger in Liverpool, for example. Other people, of course, have benefited hugely from being opponents of their party leadership. Look, for example, at the Labour MP who ran for the Scottish Parliament, who did so well. Look, on the other hand, someone who stayed within the party, but the new leader of the Welsh Assembly, someone who ran against Tony Blair's chosen candidate, and months later, in fact, found that sheer pressure ensured that he actually did inherit the crown.
Nick, thanks very much indeed for the moment. Well, let's get some reaction from one of Mr Dobson's rivals to be Mayor of London. The Liberal Democrat candidate Susan Kramer joins us now from Westminster. Susan Kramer, do you take some comfort from this result? It looks as though it might benefit Mr Frank Dobson's rivals.
Well, Frank Dobson, I welcome him to the race, but he didn't win a majority of the Labour Party, and I don't think he'll win a majority of Londoners, quite frankly. And if Ken is to be believed, it looks as though we've got an ongoing civil war inside Labour.
If Ken Livingston decides to run as independent, do you relish that fight?
Well, I welcome anybody to this race. I mean, this is meant to be a democracy. So as far as I'm concerned, the more that stand, the merrier. But frankly, I think between them, Frank and Ken have basically split their core vote. It gives a real opportunity to somebody in my position, both because people are absolutely fed up with their general behaviour and because, you know, it gives them a chance to think again. And they're turning to people like me.
So what will you offer?
Well, offer that, first of all, a good level of competence and a focus on London's issues, not on this sort of personality slam bang that's going on between the other candidates. I stand very strongly for keeping the Tube in private hands. I suppose I'm now the only official candidate that takes that position. Keep the Tube in public hands, raise the money through bonds, improving public transport, safety in the streets, a new community safety force, regeneration of our poor areas, including affordable housing. Strong programmes, those things matter to Londoners.
Susan Kramer, thank you very much indeed.
You are welcome.
Well, we're rejoined in the studio by Tony Howard. Tony, just a brief moment there to talk about some of the issues that we're not hearing too much about at the moment. I mean, are the issues going to continue to be submerged by all the talk about process and personalities?
Well, I don't think they will be by May. I mean, I think then that people will sort of be voting on what they see. I think that Susan Kramer's got a good card there in that people do not want the Tube to be privatised. Now, if Ken had been elected as the official Labour candidate, there would have been trouble between him and those who are making Labour's manifesto. I don't think that there's going to be a great deal of trouble between Frank Dobson and the Millbank Tower people, and so probably Labour will stand for a semi-privatisation of the Tube. That may count against him. But basically, I think it is going to be, as most mayoral elections are in America, they tend to be personality conflicts, and that's why the old party hacks don't like them, because they think that they lose control if someone is elected on his good looks, like John Lindsay, or if he's elected because he's black, or if he's Jewish, or if he's Puerto Rican, or whatever it is. They're elected on these kind of in America. Now, we don't have that here, but we do, I think, have the idea that you vote for someone because you like the cut of his jib, and you don't vote because the Labour policy plank on X is something that you dislike or approve of.
Also, there's the issue of carpetbagging, of course, which
yes.
often
I think that's
plagues elections of that kind. But I mean, here, I mean, Frank Dobson can't be accused of that. He's a thorough London.
Oh no, he's not.
London Labour man, isn't he?
He's really. You only got to listen to him. He's a Yorkshireman, really. Now he has led a London council, but basically, I think his heart's in Yorkshire, and in his whole attitude of life, he looks like a Yorkshire alderman. You know, about 1935 or something like that.
You don't think he's lived that down yet?
I don't think he's lived it down entirely. Now, Ken has some good fortune of speaking like a Londoner and having sort of estuary English and all that. And I think, as far as I know, was sort of born and brought up in London. I don't think it's going to count against Frank Dobson that he was Yorkshire born and Yorkshire bred. But he isn't. It's not like being a Cockney. It's not like being sort of indigenous. But basically, I think people do tend to vote in these kind of elections because the man is being chosen as a figurehead, and they will vote for the figurehead that they feel at home with. There isn't any power in the job, as Nick was telling us. That's one of the odd things. There is less power in being Mayor of London in direct terms than there was in being leader of the GLC.
Tony Howard, thank you. Well, one of Ken Livingston's supporters, Diane Abbott MP, joins me now from our Westminster studio. Well, I describe you as a supporter, Diane Abbott. I mean, do you remain a supporter?
Ken won every single ballot of rank and file party people. He won every single ballot of every single trade union by 2-1. He won the ballot of the members in relation to Frank Dobson by 2-1. Because of the quirks of the Electoral College, Frank Dobson has emerged as our candidate. But I don't believe that Frank's position is sustainable.
So what are you suggesting should happen next?
Well, I think Frank needs to consider his position. The world now knows that despite the National Party throwing everything against Ken except the kitchen sink, Ken was able to beat him by 2-1 in every single ballot of rank and file members. The only group of people that voted for Frank in any numbers were members of Parliament, and we didn't have a secret ballot, and we came under considerable pressure. Frank must consider his position, and he must look at what happened in Wales. Alan Michael, a nice man, a good man, a competent man, but he went forward, and the world knew he didn't have the support of rank and file Welsh Labour Party supporters.
If Frank Dobson reconsiders his position at this point, he will think, well, I've resigned from the cabinet to pursue this race. I've submitted myself to the due procedure, however flawed that may have been, and I've won a majority of the vote. It would be unthinkable for him to resign.
He's won the college, but every single trade union that balloted, Ken beat him 2-1. With the members, Ken beat him 2-1. Frank has been in the party long enough to know his position is not sustainable.
Diane Abbott, we have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us. Now, let's get the weather from Dan Corbett.
Well, it's not too bad for some of us looking to the outside.
Frank Dobson scrapes in on a second ballot to be Labour's mayoral candidate. The royal household sacks a trainee cook who allegedly threatened to poison the Queen. And in sport, Man United are 6 points ahead at the top of the Premiership after their 1-0 victory over Leeds. This is BBC News 24. I'm Peter Coey. Frank Dobson has won the contest to be Labour's candidate in the elections for Mayor of London. The result was close. Frank Dobson gained 51.5% of the vote in a second ballot, with Ken Livingston getting 48.5%. Ken Livingston called it a tainted result and called on Mr Dobson to consider his position.
In by the narrowest of margins, it was a close call for Frank Dobson. He always had the support of Labour MPs and MEPs, but the unions and a majority of ordinary members backed Ken Livingston. He pulled through on the second ballot with a 3% lead. The question now is, will Livingston stand as an independent candidate? Before the result came in, he expressed his anger that the selection he believed favoured Mr Dobson.
Ken is a Labour man through and through. Ken will not run as independent, and I don't believe, deep down in my soul, that Ken is the type of man to run away to the High Court to fight Labour's battles, internal battles.
He's raised challenges already which are going to have to be resolved by either the internal party procedure of the National Executive, or it could end up somewhere else. But quite honestly, there's got to be seen to be democracy within the party, and if the party's choice is then denied the nomination, well, members ask questions, members ask me questions, members of the public ask me questions about this, as I'm sure they do my colleagues here.
Relief for Tony Blair, who warned the selection of Ken Livingston would be disastrous for London. But this may not be the end of the government's problems. Ken Livingston may continue to be a thorn in their side, as he now considers whether to challenge the result. Lucy Atherton, BBC News.
Well, a short time ago, Ken Livingston gave this reaction outside his home in North London.
I first want to thank everyone who has voted for me. The overwhelming majority of Labour Party members and trade unions have voted for me, whereas Frank has secured the support of just over 1/3 of Labour Party members. This huge democratic mandate is a ringing endorsement of the policies I have put to the London Labour Party. The support I have received from party members, trade unionists and ordinary Londoners has been overwhelming. I'm grateful to them for their encouragement throughout this campaign. This result has been delivered by one trade union boss, one retired MEP and one small co-op branch which did not ballot its members. It is based on the theft of 8% of the Electoral College votes by Sir Ken Jackson and the South London Co-op, who refused to allow their members to cast their own votes and cast them instead for Frank Dobson. I urge everybody to stay inside the Labour Party and fight to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. There must now be a serious question mark over whether Frank can hope to beat Stephen Norris on May the 4th, when Londoners will widely perceive the Labour nomination has been stolen. The lesson of Wales is that our voters cannot be taken for granted. A Labour campaign that was dead in the water from day one would limp on to polling day and never allow us to get on to the real issues that matter to Londoners, such as transport, unemployment and crime. In the interests of uniting the Labour Party, I hope Frank Dobson will consider his position over the next few days. He must decide whether he is willing to accept this tainted result or stand down in the interests of Labour and London. Over the last 6 months, Londoners have had to listen to the politicians. Now it is time for politicians to listen to Londoners, and I shall be saying nothing further until I have had a chance to listen to Londoners myself. Thank you very much.
Well, that was Ken Livingston speaking a few moments ago. Our chief political correspondent, Nick Robinson, is at Labour headquarters in Westminster. Nick, Ken Livingston, clearly not a happy man, though he may well have been privately pleased with the popular vote he's won for himself. A lot of position considering to go on at the moment.
Certainly is. Listen to the strength of that language. He talked about theft, stolen, a campaign dead in the water. Now, what is the significance of him saying he will say nothing more and that the party should listen to Londoners? It can only mean that he's hoping that Labour supporters of his and that supporters outside the Labour Party too will create such a stink, such a fuss about this result that there is huge pressure either on Frank Dobson to stand down, as he says, although frankly it is very hard indeed to ever see that happening, or indeed for him to have the excuse to run as an independent candidate. There is simply no other reason for him to say those things. Whatever words Mr Livingston has uttered in the past, and he has said some pretty strong words about the fact he will never leave the Labour Party, why else is he asking these questions? Why else is he questioning this result? Now, we'll see this very, very soon indeed. You're already showing Labour MPs are very unhappy with this result, Peter. We'll see opinion polls from tomorrow, which will test whether the public here in London want Ken Livingston or Frank Dobson, and the pressure will build and build and build.
Well, to take one example of Ken Livingston's fellow MPs, I was speaking to Diane Abbott about an hour or so ago before the result came out, and she was saying that if Frank Dobson won, then she and her colleagues would support him. Is it really and now she's saying that he should be considering his position. So does it really boil down to the fact that it's actually a very narrow victory?
It does boil down to the fact it's extremely narrow victory, and you have to be careful about listening to what MPs say in public rather than what they say in private. Understand that no one can call on Ken Livingston to run as an independent. He can't say he's considering it, because to do so would mean that they might well get kicked out of the Labour Party. But if they question the result, if they throw doubt on it, if they ask Frank Dobson to consider his position, if indeed they say their voters and people in the Labour Party want Ken Livingston to consider running as an independent, that's all code for saying the same thing. It's all code for saying let's not accept this result, let's either get Dobson out or get Livingston to run as an independent. Now we'll have to have a measure of this. Now let's be fair, a lot of people have voted for Frank Dobson, many MPs, many trade unionists, some people here at the Labour Party headquarters are pointing out that if all the trade unions had split their vote, as against doing it as a block vote, that would have helped Frank Dobson rather than harmed him. However, it's a pretty startling result that the man who Tony Blair was desperate to stop got almost 55% of first preferences amongst ordinary Labour members, and Frank Dobson barely scraped a third of them. It's hardly the best platform on which to win a popular vote election.
Nick, very briefly, we're expecting a Labour press conference, aren't we, in the next half hour? Can we expect that to be an enthusiastic endorsement of Frank Dobson's victory?
I don't know if they'll be enthusiastic, but they will have to get this campaign going. They want to move on. They want Frank Dobson to be accepted as the candidate. The key is not to be talking about this process anymore. But it's going to be awful hard, because there are a lot of people, enemies of the Labour Party, as well as people within the Labour Party who are enemies of the leadership, that don't want this issue to move on, and they'll fight awfully hard, Peter, to ensure it doesn't.
All right, Nick, thanks very much for the moment. I'm rejoined in the studio now by Anthony Howard, the political historian and commentator. Tony, you heard what Ken Livingston had to say there. Some pretty unparliamentary language, wasn't it?
I agreed with everything I think that Nick Robinson said. I mean, using these kind of highly charged words is very, very indicative. He did, of course, say at the very beginning that he urged all his supporters to stay within the Labour Party. I think that was advice for this coming week rather than necessarily forever, i.e. he wants to be in his toughest negotiating position. The only thing which makes sense for his tactics, and I think he's been around for a long time, I agree with you, he can't really think this is possible, but he was, I suppose, trying to bluff Dobson. He's trying to say, you know, you stand for mayor and you'll be defeated, and you'll be defeated by a Tory, and what good is that going to do for anyone? And he's hoping, I suppose, the polls in the next week will show him well ahead as the choice for Londoners, and possibly, this is what I think would be the most damaging thing for the Labour Party, so show Steve Norris well ahead of Frank Dobson. And if it comes down to the Labour Party having to weigh, do they want to throw the contest, give it as a gift on a plate to the Tories, or can they swallow their pride and get Dobson to stand down? They might think about it, but there's no way you can do that. I mean, the Prime Minister would never forgive Dobson. If Dobson said, look, my nerve's gone, sorry, Tony, I can't go on with it anymore, he'd say, are you a man or are you a wimp? You know?
He's given up a lot, hasn't he?
He's given up a lot. So there's no way that Dobson, I mean, however unfortunate this result is, however much some of the language that Ken Livingston has used, one can understand. Any notion that Dobson, having fought all this time, all the money that's been spent on those mail shots, is going to say, sorry, after you, Ken, going forward, is just not in the world of reality. It's not going to happen.
Tony, thanks very much indeed. This is BBC News 24. Coming up. In sport, Man U stay at the top of the Premiership.
Within the next 15 or 20 minutes, and that he will be making a statement to the cameras. Just to go back over some of the history of this race for the Labour mayoral candidacy. It's been a bitter battle. As long ago as February of last year, 12 months ago, Ken Livingston launched what he called the Let Ken Stand campaign, because Tony Blair had made it pretty plain that he didn't want the former leader of the Greater London Council to be on the short list of candidates. That was followed by Frank Dobson attacking anonymous liars, claiming that he was under pressure to stand. And of course, finally, last November, the Labour meeting at which it was argued that Ken Livingston should not be on the shortlist, where after 2 days of wrangling he won the way. Mr Livingston now, of course, disappointed, angry, and calling on the winner, Frank Dobson, to stand down.
Well, Susan Kramer, the Liberal Democrats candidate for mayor, has been watching the process of election in both the Conservative and the Labour parties with some amusement and commenting to us over the past weeks and months. I understand this morning you were saying you just wanted anyone to stand against from the Labour Party. What do you think of Frank Dobson as your opponent?
Well, it doesn't sound as though for sure I've got Frank. This is such a shambles. I mean, the Labour Party's starting to look as bad as the Tory party. We have Frank without a majority of the Labour membership behind him, so in that case he's certainly not going to take a majority of Londoners. And it sounds as though Ken's not going to accept the verdict. So we have an ongoing continuation of the Civil War.
Although it has to be said, there is a man in position now, and we don't know. Ken Livingston hasn't said he's going to stand as an independent. He was always going to be upset and angry. After all, he did want the job. And maybe we should just wait and see how the party rallies behind their man.
Well, I obviously welcome Frank to the race, and we're going to have some good discussions. I think with Frank in, I am now the only candidate that stands for keeping the tube in private hands, raising money for it through bonds. So that is, I think, very important, because it it reflects a feeling of majority of Londoners. I'll be interested to see what Ken decides to do. I mean, this is a democratic process, and if people choose to stand, whether as party members or independents, I feel certain they should be allowed to, and I'd welcome him to the race as well. The Labour Party has divided its support. It's split down the middle. And frankly, I can only benefit from that because voters start to think, perhaps I shouldn't automatically go to the Labour Party I might typically have voted for. They already think they shouldn't automatically go to the Tory party they might have voted for. They're willing to think again, looking at this as a very different race.
Ken Livingston says that he doesn't believe that Mr Dobson has a democratic mandate to take up the position he's now been elected to. Do you have concerns about that?
Well, I do believe, obviously, in a one-member, one-vote system. That's how I was chosen by the party. And the senior members of the party weren't allowed to pick and choose or even endorse a candidate. And that's part of devolution. That's part of transferring power. So as far as I'm concerned, it's what this London election is about. It's letting ordinary people make their choice of who they want to stand as mayor. And people in London, I've spent now 6 months walking through the streets of London, going to the high streets, talking with people, want someone who will deal with London's everyday problems, where that bus is at 7:30 in the morning, why your local shops are closing on the high street, how to get some real uniform presence out on those streets because you feel afraid, especially in the evening. And those are the issues that I'm tackling, and that's what this race should be about. Not about this internal infighting, these personality contests. This should be a race about London.
Does it mean you're going to get more airtime now?
Well, that's something I suppose the media should answer. I hope very much we're going to move more to an issues campaign. And then I do have an opportunity to really contribute. When we're talking about the Labour Party selection, I can give you an outsider's view. When you talk about what we want to do with buses, with the tubes, with the trains, then I can give you some really hard information on how we can fix the system. And that's what I got in the race to do. You know, I'm a user of public transport who one day had enough and said, let's get this system fixed. And I would be so pleased now if we can move on to discussing those issues, because that's what London deserves.
Susan Kramer, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you indeed.
Just to remind you of the main story here on Sky News this Sunday afternoon. Frank Dobson has won the battle to be Labour's candidate for Mayor of London. In a neck-and-neck race, the former Health Secretary came out with just over 3% more of the vote than his rival Ken Livingston.
Mr Livingston has described the result as tainted and called on Mr Dobson to consider standing down in the interests of party unity.
You're watching Sky News. Coming up, all the sport, including the latest on the day's FA Cup action.
Plus, England head for victory in their one-day series with Zimbabwe.
This week on Showbiz Weekly, Brooke Shields talks about her...
The stage there set for Frank Dobson, the man that Labour can now officially say will be fighting Stephen Norris for the Mayor of London. We're expecting Mr Dobson to appear on the stage very soon, and no word from him yet. John Ray, our political correspondent, is there. John, are we expecting a triumphalist Mr Dobson, or is he going to have to be very careful about how he handles this?
I think the overall emotion you'll get from Frank Dobson is that of one of great relief, because this was very, very close. We've just been handed the actual detailed figures of the breakdown. I can tell you on the first round of voting, Frank Dobson got about 49.5% of the vote compared to Ken Livingston's 46% of the vote. And then they had to exclude Glenda Jackson, and when they redistributed her votes, in fact, Ken Livingston gained more of her votes than Frank Dobson, but Frank still got enough, just under 2%, to push him over that 50% winning line. But by goodness, that is very, very close. Just looking at the breakdown of the figures as well, we see from, just to, I guess, prove the or evidence for the point that Ken Livingston has been making of the popular vote, the vote of the rank and file of the Labour Party. Frank Dobson got about 35% of that vote, whereas Ken Livingston really romped away with 55%. So that's a 20% difference. That is what Ken Livingston describes as a ringing democratic endorsement of his manifesto, the policies that he's been putting through. But again, interestingly, because we've had a lot of complaints from Ken Livingston about the use of the union bloc vote. In fact, the unions came down even more strongly on the side of Ken Livingston. Within that section, that third of the Electoral College, the result was 62% for Ken Livingston against 27% for Frank Dobson. Where Frank Dobson won, as we knew all along, was on the votes of MPs, MEPs and candidates for the Greater London Assembly. There, and this was not a secret ballot, remember, and this is where a lot of complaints have arisen. The MPs were not voting in secret, and there's some suggestion they were under pressure to vote for Frank Dobson. Here, Frank Dobson won 87% of that vote, so you can see that's where he really did win it. We had a briefing just a few minutes ago off camera before the on-camera parts start, and Labour officials here were at great pains to go out of their way to say that Ken Livingston was asked when he got on the shortlist whether he would sign up to the rules of the game. He knew the rules of the game. They said he signed up, and he gave a guarantee that he would abide by the rules of the game. And secondly, he gave a guarantee that he would not stand as an independent. Now, I think those are two guarantees that Labour doesn't really want to have to call in. They hope, very much hope, that Ken Livingston will eventually toe the line and back Frank Dobson.
Well, John, the fact that Ken Livingston came out of his house and said he urged everybody to stay inside the Labour Party would seem to indicate that he has no plans to quit.
That does sound significant, but again, he was asked the question as he went back inside whether he would stand as an independent, and he didn't rule it out. You'd thought if he was going to not stand as an independent, he would have said today. He said, I won't. What he actually said is, I'm going to go and listen to the views of London members. That, to me, I think we can take the inference from that there is still a possibility of him fighting as an independent candidate. But let's remember the price that he would have to pay. He would have to leave a party that he spent all his adult life supporting. Anybody who within Labour who supported him would have to go with him, and I think frankly there are people, friends of his on the left of the Labour Party, who will say, Frank, don't be so silly, sorry Ken, don't be so silly, you really have to toe the line, maybe your time will come again in the future. And I'm just looking across, I think we're seeing Labour Party officials coming in to the conference room here, and here indeed is Frank Dobson. You'll probably be able to see him in a minute. There goes Frank Dobson now taking the stage, looking relieved, looking very pleased in fact, looking like the bouncy Frank Dobson that we remember actually before this campaign started. The first voice you hear will be Jim Fitzpatrick, the chairman of the, he's an MP but he's also head of the Greater London Labour Party, and he'll make the opening remarks. When the photographers get away from Frank Dobson, who of course is the man at the centre of attention for a moment, the star of the show.
Always some confusion, John, at these moments, isn't it, as the photographers try and settle down. But I think in the next few minutes, next few moments, we should hear.
Welcome. I'm very pleased to be able to formally announce the result of Labour's choice of candidate for the forthcoming election of Mayor of London. Labour is introducing new devolved systems of governance across Britain, and the office of Mayor of London is a major part of this process. Over 5 million voters in London will have the opportunity to directly elect their mayor in what will be the largest election in British history for a single public representative. The candidates for the Labour nomination, Frank Dobson, Glenda Jackson and Ken Livingston, were shortlisted by the London Selection Board after interview, as set out by Labour's National Executive Committee, who determined the selection process in line with party rules. All the candidates agreed and signed up to abide by the process. The National Executive appointed Unity Security Balloting Limited to conduct the ballot. Unity Security Balloting are completely independent of the Labour Party and one of the main organisations operating in this field. They are registered for the conduct of statutory trade union ballots and conduct many ballots for local authorities and others. The arrangements they employ for the Labour Party have been designed to meet their required standards and in line with their statutory obligations. The Electoral College selection consists of 3 sections and operates on a system of preference voting on an exhaustive ballot. A candidate receiving more than 50% of the Electoral College vote shall be declared elected. 1/3 of the college is comprised of paid-up party members in London, 1/3 by trade unions and socialist societies, and 1/3 by London MPs, MEPs and Labour's endorsed candidates for the new Greater London Assembly, which will be elected at the same time as the Mayor. I now call on Anne Hock, the independent scrutineer from Unity Security Balloting, to announce the results. Anne, please.
Good afternoon. Anne Hock, the independent scrutineer, Unity Security Balloting Services. I will now announce the result of the Labour Party's London mayoral candidate selection. The results of the first preferences in the Electoral College were as follows. Frank Dobson, 49.569%. Glenda Jackson, 4.421%. Ken Livingston, 46.009%. The votes for the candidate with the lowest vote were redistributed and the second preference votes transferred to the remaining candidates. The final vote was as follows. Frank Dobson, 51.53%. Ken Livingston, 48.47%. In accordance with the rules of the Electoral College, the candidate gaining more than 50% of the votes cast is elected. Frank Dobson is therefore selected as the Labour candidate for London Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Ladies and gentlemen, Labour has fulfilled our manifesto commitment to hold a referendum to establish a Greater London Assembly and directly elected mayor. In choosing our candidate for this enormously important new position, the Electoral College means that every party member in London, every trade union and socialist society affiliated to the London Labour Party, and every London MP, MEP and Assembly candidate have all been involved in selecting Labour's choice for mayor. The selection process has not been easy, as it is both a new experience for everyone and involves difficult choices between candidates who are all committed members of the Labour Party. What is essential after today is that we put the process behind us and focus on what everyone knows is the real battle ahead. I'm sure that after completing our selection process, Londoners now expect us to focus on their concerns and how a Labour candidate would make London a better place for everyone who lives and works here. I call on the whole of the Labour movement in London to unite behind Frank Dobson in the fight to beat the Conservative candidate Steve Norris, who would do nothing to tackle the problems faced by ordinary Londoners. Frank Dobson, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, the Labour Party promised we would give Londoners the chance to elect their mayor. The Labour government have kept that promise, and it's a great honour to have been chosen as the Labour candidate for mayor. Throughout the selection campaign, I've met people from every part of London. As the campaign went on, the policies I've put forward have gained more and more support. I've made clear my three main policies and set out the ways to deliver them. First, to crack down on crime and disorder to make London the safest capital in Europe. Second, to rebuild the tube and modernise the buses and trains to give London once again the best transport network in Europe. Third, to retain and create jobs by keeping London as the business capital of Europe. Nothing less will do. For years under the Tories, London has not been doing as well as it should. Crime and disorder have made Londoners fearful. The transport system was shamefully neglected, not least by Steve Norris when he was the minister in charge, and London has lost too many jobs. I've lived and worked in London all my adult life. My wife Janet and I brought up our family here. We know London's advantages. We also know London's problems, and we know them because we've lived them. And like most Londoners, we're sick of what's been going wrong. I'm determined as mayor to put right those wrongs. This city has many strengths: financial services, universities, colleges, medical schools and research bodies. London has manufacturing and creative industries, and as we've seen this week, is a centre of fashion. London enjoys some of the finest theatres, libraries and concert halls in the world, some of the best museums and galleries, and some of the greatest sporting venues, shops and markets. They attract huge numbers of visitors, as well as raising the quality of life for Londoners. We need to build on these strengths to deal with London's weaknesses. Londoners want a city that's safer, cleaner, healthier and more prosperous. They want trains and buses that run efficiently too, and that's what I'm pledged to bring about. As mayor, I'll work with the Metropolitan Police to make London safer. As mayor, I'll rebuild the tube and make sure we make better use of the buses. As mayor, I will work with business to retain and attract investment. I've been given a big challenge. The Labour Party has put its trust in me. Now I seek the trust of the people of London. I'm confident that together we can rise to the challenge. Thank you.
Will I take questions, ladies and gentlemen? And there will be further opportunities afterwards, but we'll be here for about half a minute.
Sky News, can I just ask
Hold on a second, please. One at a time, if you would. And Trevor Phillips, who you know is head of the top-up list and Frank's proposed deputy, will be answering questions also. John.
Frank, you won the contest, but with barely a third of local party members behind you. Now Ken Livingston has reacted, and he's in effect arguing that you're a lame duck candidate and should stand down from the contest. That's Ken Livingston's argument. How do you answer him and that argument?
Well, first of all, I got 40% of the individual membership when the vote was redistributed, in line with what was agreed. I've not been in any way responsible for this process. As you know, I was opposed to the introduction of this process. But like Ken Livingston and Glenda Jackson, I undertook, before we knew the outcome, to stand by the result. And I stand by the result, and I expect the other candidates to do what they said they'd do.
Jonathan?
Can I just say, Ken Livingston won, what, 55% of the rank and file vote. He won the majority of union votes where unions balloted. He seems, according to the opinion polls, to have the support of the wider London electorate. Will you find a place in your team as you go forward to the ballot on May the 4th?
Ken Livingston, Glenda Jackson are both very talented people, and I would like them to be involved both in our campaign to secure a Labour mayor for London and also in any administration that I presided over. But I don't want to be patronising. They may want to take part, they may not want to take part, but I would want to discuss with them what they thought they could do, because, as I say, they're both very talented people.
Thanks.
Frank, have you spoken to the Prime Minister yet? And if you have, or if you are about to, will you thank him for fixing the contest for you?
You'd better address that remark to party officials, because the arrangements that you're referring to are nothing to do with me.
Hold on a sec, please.
Are you entirely satisfied that you can beat an independent campaign if Ken Livingston were to run one?
I'm satisfied that as Labour candidate I will command the support of the bulk of the Labour Party in London, the bulk of Labour voters in London and many other voters in London, because one of the things I want to make clear is that the mayor can't function just as one individual just trying to get self-publicity or a fancy name for themselves or a name in history because they're the first mayor. What we want is someone practical and someone who's willing to work with every Londoner who wants to improve this city of ours. So I'm determined, for instance, to work with all the people who are elected to the Greater London Assembly, people from all parties. I'm determined to work with all borough councils in London, including ones run by parties other than the Labour Party. We've got to work together with people in business, people in the trade unions, people in voluntary organisations. That's the only way. We've got to create partnerships for a better London.
Trevor.
Well, I think that the outcome of this is the end of this process. Everybody said before we got to this stage that they would accept the result that's announced today. The essential point from here on in for our party is to unite. And I heard Glenda Jackson speaking both on radio and TV today, and I agreed with every word she said. We have a tradition of having decided what we were going to do, of everybody getting behind it. And I certainly would expect everybody in the Labour Party, everybody who says they support the Labour Party, to get behind Frank now, as I have done.
Frank, I can see you say that the arrangements were nothing to do with me, you said, and one accepts that, but nonetheless, they're the arrangements that did get you elected. What do you therefore say to the charge from Ken Livingston that it was a fix?
Well, first of all, I repeat, the system that was used was not introduced because I asked for it. I was against it. And I entered the race in the belief that there would be a one-member, one-vote decision about who would be the Labour candidate. And as I got, even in these awkward circumstances, 40% of the vote of the members, individual members in London, I'm confident that my judgment was right, and that if we had had simply a one-member, one-vote ballot, I would have won it.
You didn't like the system, Mr Dobson, as you said yourself. Nearly 55% of Labour Party members in London voted for Ken Livingston. Isn't this, unfortunately, the Millbank declaration of a Millbank fix?
The procedure for the Electoral College was agreed by National Labour Party conference rules since 1981. It selected Neil Kinnock, John Smith, Tony Blair and John Prescott, his deputy, as well as the leader for Scotland and Wales. The system has been approved. These are our rules and the candidates agreed to abide by it.
With great respect, that simply isn't true.
Does stand as an independent, your main opposition will be Ken Livingston and Stephen Norris. What would you say to people about why they shouldn't vote for those two people?
Well, I assume that Ken Livingston is a man of his word, and when he's told individual members of the Labour Party and large numbers of members of the Labour Party that he would not consider standing as an independent in order to get their votes, I assume that he'll keep by his word.
And Stephen Norris? What would you say about that?
I'll say that Stephen Norris has dealt disaster in London. He was a deplorable, totally unsuccessful Minister of Transport for London. It was under him that they signed the dreadfully unsuccessful Jubilee line extension contract, which ended up with the line 2 years late and £1.5 billion over the cost. So he owes Londoners £1.5 billion before he starts. And secondly, you should ask the people from the Marchioness campaign what they think of his contribution, because he was the person who constantly refused to have an independent inquiry into the Marchioness disaster, and even refused to make public the report of the first inspector in the inquiry.
Frank, it obviously detracts from your moral authority that the only group who were balloted in which you had a majority was the Fabian Society. Why do you think you did so badly? Was it because you were labelled as Mr. Blair's man? Have you suffered the curse of Blair?
I think in all the circumstances I did very well in the ballot of Labour Party members in London. After all, I think some of Ken Livingston's followers, and possibly even Ken himself at one point, said that I wouldn't have any moral standing unless I got 40% of them, and I did.
Frank, you stood down as Health Secretary in order to fight this campaign. How long do you intend to remain an MP?
When I announced that I was standing, I said that if I became Mayor, I would remain a Member of Parliament until the next general election, and I would then stand down.
Michael.
Mike White. I think nobody's remembered to ask this question. Ken has said today that you ought to take a few days to reconsider your position as a man of honour and to make way for him to be the proper candidate. With the TV cameras rolling, could you tell us what your answer is? I'm on the edge of my chair here.
My answer to that is I stick by my word. I gave my word, Ken Livingston gave his word, and Glenda Jackson gave their word, that each of us said we would abide by the outcome of this process. And I'm keeping my word.
So you're not going to take it?
You're not kidding.
Frank, Needham, BBC. You said you accepted the result before the process set off, but how do you feel about being a second-choice candidate now?
Well, that's your description, and you're wrong. I'm the first-choice candidate under the method that all three candidates accepted.
Frank, you say that you closed your remarks by saying the Labour Party has put its trust in me, but in straight numerical terms, that signally is not the case. What's your response to that?
Well, you obviously can't count, and you weren't listening to the unity balloting person announcing the result.
Frank, you don't actually look very pleased to have won. Is that because you're filled with dread at the prospect of having to be mayor?
Yeah. Well, before you go any further, can I just put on record, I am not depressed.
Frank, I mean, everyone can take the point about what you said about people signing up in advance, but isn't it the case that a bit like Alan Michael, people are going to be coming after you throughout this campaign saying you were not the choice of Labour Party members in London, you were not the choice of trade union members in London, and therefore you're going to be constantly facing that charge? How will you deal with that?
Shut up.
Can I make a point here? I mean, unlike, I think, almost anybody in this room, I have talked to literally, I count up, 6,000 or 7,000 Labour Party members during this campaign. I've physically been in rooms with them. I've sat at weekends canvassing. Now, there is no doubt in my mind, and there was no question in my own mind when I decided to run with Frank Dobson, that he was London Labour Party members' favourite. That is why I stood down and ran and ended my own campaign, and why I supported Frank Dobson, because London Labour Party members, given their, no other circumstances, we were convinced, my team was convinced, and I remain convinced, wanted Frank Dobson to be the candidate. We know that since then there have been all sorts of things that have made people angry about the process. Frank has been clear that he himself would not have done it this way. We know that a substantial number of people who voted for Ken were not voting because they wanted Ken Livingston to be mayor. They were voting because they were angry about the way they were asked to vote. And I can tell you that, having spoken personally to thousands of Labour Party members. Now, we can learn the lessons of this, but the suggestion that's being made here, which is that there are people who out there who hate Frank Dobson and will not work for him, is just absolute rubbish.
What about the Alan Michael precedents, though? That's the problem, isn't it? I mean, you face that problem where we've seen a similar situation in Wales, where Alan Michael was not the choice of Welsh Labour Party members, and he's paid the price for it. And Frank, don't you risk paying the same?
Well, as you're obviously a constitutional expert, Seamus, I think you ought to recognise there is a marked difference between a directly elected mayor who cannot, under any circumstances, be removed by the Greater London Assembly and the first secretary in Wales who demonstrably could.
Gentleman at the back then, Trevor.
Nick Robinson, BBC News 24. Mr Dobson, 65% of Labour members chose not to choose you in terms of their first process, and yet you say that the Labour Party have put their trust in you. What explanation have you got for why they didn't back you, and what do you say to them who may feel very cheated that they haven't got the result they voted for?
Well, in every election there are a lot of people don't get the result they voted for. That's what happens in elections. All I can say is this, that large numbers of people who weren't voting for me told me that they had no objection to me at all. They were simply protesting against the process. And having registered their protest against the process and saying they've nothing against me, I assume they'll now be supporting me, because that's what they said they would do.
Frank, you've obviously explained before why you're opposed to this system of voting. Could you do so again and explain why you think you actually lost votes, if we believe what Trevor's saying, because people voted for Ken Livingston because they don't like the way that they were asked to vote?
Well, let me make it clear again. I decided to run for Mayor of London, or to be the Labour candidate to be Mayor of London, and give up my job in the Cabinet, when I assumed that the Labour candidate would be chosen by a one-member, one-vote ballot. The party then introduced an electoral college. People have wanted to register an objection to the introduction of the electoral college, and quite a lot of them have registered that by not voting for me, and they would otherwise have voted for me. So I believe that if anybody has been damaged by this system, it's been me.
Frank Dobson, Labour's candidate for mayor, giving his first thoughts after beating off Ken Livingston, not by a convincing majority, 3% the total in the end. And Mr Dobson, a jovial, undoubtedly delighted candidate, laughing off suggestions that he was depressed, laughing off suggestions that he might listen to Ken Livingston and stand down, and saying this was a great honour to be chosen to be Labour's candidate. He would fight crime, he would rebuild the tube, and he would keep London the business capital of Europe.
More reaction and analysis along with the rest of the day's news at the top of the hour. See you then.
By Number 10 and by the National Labour Party machine. What do you say to those people?
Well, first of all, I wanted to be the Labour candidate for mayor, and I want to be the mayor, and I've wanted that for quite a time. Tony Blair does support me. I welcome his support. I think he's a great Prime Minister. I think that any Labour candidate would welcome the support of a Labour Prime Minister, as indeed both Glenda and Ken made clear. They would have welcomed his support, but he gave it to me. But what I can make clear today, and what I've made clear to him all along, is I expect him to deliver for the people of London. And if he doesn't deliver for the people of London, I will certainly put up a fight to make sure that he and the rest of the government do deliver for London. He knows that, and I think actually quite a few people sitting here asking me questions would not say that I am usually anybody's patsy, and I'm certainly not.
From the Herald. What's wrong with the electoral college system, and should it be ever used again?
Well, it's it's messy and it doesn't look very straightforward, but I have no particular objection to an electoral college system if people have known all along that one was going to be used, and secondly, that within each part of that system where there are the affiliated organisations, then the affiliated organisations should ballot all their members, should send literature from all the candidates, should then split their vote in accordance with the preferences of their members. Very few did that.
The Electoral College, if I can remind you, is a matter of party rules. Conference approved the Electoral College for the election of senior figures within the party, and indeed it was the trade unions at the National Executive who insisted in having a say in this matter. Gentlemen, Michael here, then Joe, and then we're going to wrap up. Michael.
Small one coming off the back of that, many of the unions didn't disaggregate their votes. Have you got a sense of whether that would have made a great deal of difference to the result if you take the AEU, which didn't ballot either? I mean, how does that side of it work out? Have you got better calculations than we had an hour ago? And secondly, on policy, you're locked into PPP on the refinancing of London Underground. Most experts, many experts without an axe to grind in this election, say the bond route is the right one. Have you got any room for manoeuvre to unpick that?
Well, I'll ignore the stuff. I simply don't know, because I don't know. I haven't got all the details of the union votes, but my belief is that had they all done what I've just said, then I would have won under that system as well. But if it comes to the policy matter, and this is what I want to make clear, as far as I'm concerned, from now on, process is a matter for other people. It's nothing to do with me. I had no responsibility for the process. From now on, it's policy. And let me just say, if you want to see the tube in this great city of ours renewed, we can't go on with the old-fashioned system that Steve Norris put through for the Jubilee Line extension and that Ken supports or supported for modernising the rest of the tube. We need a system where the people who are carrying out the work carry the can financially if they don't deliver on time, and where they spend their own money if they go over the estimates. And the PPP can deliver that, providing it leaves the running of the Underground in the hands of London Underground, providing aspects of safety are cleared in advance with a health and safety executive at every stage, and thirdly, that each individual proposition is a good bargain. Some of them won't be good bargains, some of them will.
Joe?
On the basis of these results, you're not going to be seen as the choice of London Labour Party members, so how are you going to expect them to go out and campaign for you over the next few months?
Well, I think they'll follow the wise advice of Glenda Jackson and say our party unites round our candidates and sets about putting forward the policies that we believe will make lives better for Londoners. And I come back to what those policies are and what my three main priorities are. Firstly, we've got to tackle crime and disorder. We've got to back up the Metropolitan Police to make this city of ours safe. At the moment, it's not safe. Next, we've got to modernise the transport system and in particular rebuild the tube. And thirdly, we've got to make London even more attractive for business, because it's only by making it attractive for business that we can retain existing jobs and create new jobs. Those are the things that Londoners want to talk about. They don't want to talk about anything to do with the Labour Party processes.
Last question, Charles.
Yeah, it's only a point of confusion to clear up, if possible. It confused me anyway. Frank said that he thought that the contest would be held for the Labour candidate on the basis of one member, one vote, as did a lot of other people. Jim says, if I understood him rightly, that it was always going to be that the rules say that it's got to be the Electoral College, and that there was never any question of anything else. I don't see how both of you can be right. Which is right, please?
So what I'm saying is that the National Executive Committee decided that the Electoral College system would be used, and that's contained within the rules and has been used for elections before. Frank's point is that on the assumption that a one-member, one-vote ballot could have taken place or would have taken place, he feels that he could have won that. And certainly the evidence is that in the last few weeks of the campaign, when process had been put behind us and policy was being discussed, Frank's campaign, Trevor's campaign, was going from strength to strength. I don't disagree with what Frank's been saying at all. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of this part. There will be opportunities to have one-to-ones with Frank and Trevor. There will be a short photo opportunity with Frank to the side of the platform.
Well, that is the end of this conference, and we now know, of course, confirmation that Frank Dobson is the Labour Party candidate for London Mayor. He argued that he'd done surprisingly well in the circumstances, and that if the rules had been different, it would have helped him rather than harmed him, that he expected there to be a one-member, one-vote contest for this nomination, and had there been so, he would have won that. And he laughed off suggestions from Ken Livingston that he might go away now and reconsider his position. He set out, of course, his policy objectives, but most of the questions, as one might have predicted, were on the process and how he could defend the process he was involved in.
You're watching BBC News 24. It's just after 3 o'clock. I'm Peter Coey. Our main story today: the former Health Secretary Frank Dobson has narrowly won the contest to be Labour's candidate for Mayor of London. He polled 51.5% of the total vote in the Electoral College, while his main rival, Ken Livingston, got nearly 48.5%.
Toward the bottom of the screen, you'll see people running.